NFL minicamp is in full swing. NFL OTAs are now in the rearview mirror. There's plenty of guys who have risen their stock in this process, and there's a lot of guys' stock who's currently falling at the moment. I'm going to break it all down here on the Risers and Fallers podcast on Player Profiler. So, the first guy we're going to talk about today is going to be new Denver Broncos running back J.K. Dobbins. J.K. Dobbins, he's down 14 spots, since the move to Denver, which is a little bit surprising given the fact that, he lands in a pretty solid situation for himself. I think many people were hoping that Dobbins was going to go to maybe the Dallas Cowboys, who have a running back room of Javonte Williams and Miles Sanders, Jaden Blue, right? Like it would have been a good fit for Dobbins from a fantasy perspective, or possibly go over to the Chicago Bears, right? Who maybe are looking for a David Montgomery type of player to fit in that Ben Johnson scheme to complement DeAndre Swift. Looks like that might be Roshan Johnson at this point, but J.K. Dobbins finds himself in Denver. And, for what it's worth, he's going as the RB51 at an ADP of 166. He was the RB24 in 2024 from a total points perspective, 18th in points per game. And he had 14.8 points per game in 2024. I think what we saw with Dobbins was a guy who started off pretty strong, right? He started to get a little bit banged up towards the end and ran out of steam maybe a little bit, but he was still very productive. He did miss 4 games last season. I think the thing to keep in mind with Dobbins here is, you know, he was with the Chargers. He had 1,000 all-purpose yards with them, and they opted to draft a running back in the first round and let Dobbins walk. But I think the other telling thing about it is they brought in a more expensive running back in Najee Harris, who has a contract that can earn him up to $9 million in incentives. And so for them to invest in the position in the NFL draft and still bring in a free agent at a more expensive cost, I think it shows that maybe they had some concerns about J.K. Dobbins and what they saw from him down the stretch, where he did lose a little bit of steam. And now he finds himself in Denver. And when you look at Denver's running back situation, you have Audric Estime, you have Jaleel McLaughlin, and then you have the rookie, RJ Harvey. And a lot of people are concerned that maybe this is a statement to RJ Harvey, where maybe Harvey is a guy who we should be concerned about. I don't think so. I think 2 running backs were always going to be the plan for Sean Payton. We've seen it time and time again. When you look at the time with the New Orleans Saints, you had Mark Ingram, you had Alvin Kamara, like those guys complemented each other, right? He's always had that. Latavius Murray as well. And so I never expected it to just be, RJ Harvey getting 80% of the snaps. That's not realistic in today's NFL to begin with. But when you look at Denver's running back room, there is a lot of opportunity here. And, if you look on Twitter and you follow Data Roma, who is a good follow and a friend of the show, he said per fantasy points, Denver was 8th in expected fantasy points last season to the running back position with 398, right? So in my expectations, right, is Dobbins is likely going to see somewhere around a 40%, right? Like share of the workload. And, Harvey's probably somewhere around 50%. And the other running backs maybe share like a small 10%, like a Jaleel and, an Audric Estime, right? I still think Harvey should be productive. Dobbins is going to be likely the guy they use at the goal line, but this is more of an indictment on the other backs in the room. They bring in a nice veteran at his ADP of 166. He's a very solid dart throw. He's going to be involved in the offense. Peyton loves to rotate his backs. I think it's a good place for him to land, though. Again, I would have preferred him to go to Dallas or Chicago. For me, I'm a little surprised he's a faller right now. As I said, down 14 spots since coming to Denver and signing. But I just think ADP probably hasn't adjusted, right? But I've been drafting Dobbins, who's practically free in best ball, and so I don't mind taking chances on him. As a guy that we know is going to be involved in this offense. I don't think he's going to be the RB1, but he's going to be the 1A, 1B. And I think that should be totally fine for RJ Harvey. And Dobbins doesn't have a ton of upside, I would say, because he doesn't, catch the football a ton. But he should still see some targets in that offense because, as we know, Sean Payton offenses, they love to target the running back position. In his career, he's always been around the top five, when it comes to targets to the running back position. But that's going to do it for J.K. Dobbins. Let's go ahead and move on to our next player. It's going to be Joe Mixon, who is currently a riser, surprisingly, since the Nick Chubb signing. He's up 3 spots in ADP currently, sitting at 54 and RB 15. I'm a little surprised as well. Again, I think maybe the market just has not adjusted to Joe Mixon, getting a running mate in, Nick Chubb. But this one concerns me. It concerns me for sure. RB 15, as I said, ADP of 54. Mixon missed voluntary organized team activities this spring, and was seen wearing a walking boot. But since then, he has shed that and is wearing a small brace, as it's been reported by those close to the team. But he's expected to be back for training camp, which is definitely a positive sign. I worry about this situation for Joe Mixon, right? You look at him last year, 12 total touchdowns, right? Back to back seasons with the Texans of 12 total touchdowns. He actually had his best yards per carry season since 2018, where he had 4.9 yards per carry. Then he had 4.2 yards per carry this past season. But he did see a little bit of a drop in receptions. He did miss 3 games, but he had 36 receptions last season, and the season prior with the Texans, he saw 52. But on a per game per basis, he was still inside the top 10 with 17.2 points per game. And Mixon was good. I think when you look at the opportunity share with Mixon, though, he was 5th in opportunity share last season, 77.7%. And opportunity shares is quite simply, the percentage of the total team running back carries plus targets. And so I don't expect Mixon to have this kind of heavy of a workload, right? It's ironic that we talked about J.K. Dobbins, and I did this specifically because they're both similar situations where both get established veterans in the room. The difference to me is that was a floor raiser for Denver. Joe Mixon has a high floor, right? And they also have players behind him. You have Dameon Pierce. They also drafted Woody Marks. So they had invested in the room, with the NFL draft, right? In Denver, they didn't have an established veteran in that room. And so it made sense to bring Dobbins in. In this situation with Mixon, this is a room that, a team that's predominantly given Mixon most of the carries and touches over the last 2 seasons that he's been there. And so to bring in an established veteran like Nick Chubb, who I don't know what Nick Chubb is. I will tell you quite honestly, I don't have a ton of exposure to Chubb. I probably won't have a ton of exposure to Chubb, maybe slightly only off the fact that if they continue to solely rely on maybe one guy like Mixon, then it's appetizing to think if Mixon gets hurt, right, Chubb can step into a likely workhorse role. But you bring in an established running back, I don't like it, if they weren't concerned about Mixon, who has the injury right now with the ankle and missed some time last year too, and his age being what it is, like I don't think they bring in Nick Chubb if those aren't real concerns, right? Joe Mixon turns 29 this season. He's been very good for them, but you know when when you think of Nick Chubb, I don't think Nick Chubb comes and signs there. Why? I would think at that point he'd probably go sign in Dallas, where he probably would have a better chance at seeing a bigger workload. He goes to the Texans. I think there is a possibility that they might be concerned about that injury. Now, when you look at some players going around him, Alvin Kamara goes 6 spots behind Joe Mixon. And quite honestly, I would rather Alvin Kamara at an ADP of 60 than Joe Mixon at an ADP of 54. There are not a ton of established players behind Alvin Kamara. And overall, Alvin Kamara still looked really good last year. And I expect him to continue, and I will continue to draft him until the wheels fall off. There's just red flags popping up for Mixon. And that concerns me, this early into the offseason. And when you look at his price tag, it's you're looking at a round 4 player. And that's a concern. Also, when you look at what they did this offseason in Houston, they also added some other pass catchers to this room. So maybe they look to throw the football a little bit more. They were a predominantly balanced, team overall. So that's my concerns with Mixon. He's a riser currently, but for me, he's a faller. I have red flags all up for Joe Mixon, and he's just not a guy that I'm like really trying to draft heavily in drafts. They brought in Woody Marks in this offseason in this draft. And he's a guy that maybe you want to target in the Origins draft, which we're going to hear about from the Podfather right now.
It is a damn shame we only get to a handful of rookie drafts every season. After doing all this rookie analysis, you want more bites at the apple. And that's why we have the Fast Draft Origins tournament. You draft 6 rookies, the top 4 into your lineup. It's best ball style, and it's just $5 to win a $5,000 first prize. So if you're passionate about Taj Brooks or RJ Harvey, get on Fast Draft and use your favorite creator's code to get a $50 deposit match. A $50 deposit match to go make thousands of dollars drafting the rookies that you know and love.
Yeah, and if you're not already on Fast Draft, you can use the promo code NOVA. That's NOVA. That is my promo code if you do want to get a deposit match and you do want to get in on the action. I think there's a ton of edges right now drafting on a platform like Fast Draft because it's new, because it's a different style of game. You're only drafting 6 players in many of the formats. And because of that, right, it changes the way you draft as opposed to some of the other platforms. But let's go ahead and move on to our next player. It's going to be Joe Burrow of the Cincinnati Bengals. And Joe Burrow is a riser. He's up 4.4 spots. He's going as quarterback 5. And right now he is 59 off the board on underdog ADP. And when I think about, drafting these high-end quarterbacks, I generally, everybody has different draft strategies. Me personally, like if I'm going to draft a high-end quarterback, I predominantly want them to have rushing upside with their legs. I do worry about Burrow, who does not have rushing upside with his legs. I mean, that's just the honest truth. I don't know what the rise entails. It just might be people bought into the fact that this defense is going to be horrendous, likely again. They have Trey Hendrickson, who right now is not reporting to the team. And, their number one overall, their number one pick in the first round, Shamar Stewart, is not reporting as well. So, that was maybe they were probably bringing in Stewart as, a safety net for if they couldn't get something done with Hendrickson and also just to add to that room. But now the guy that you were hoping could either be alongside Hendrickson or, can be a replacement for him, who is their best defender, is now not in camp either. So maybe people are buying into the fact that this defense is going to stink and Joe Burrow is going to have a really good game script where he's going to be in a lot of shootouts. We look at Joe Burrow's season last year, 22.5 points per game was good enough for 3rd in the NFL. He threw for 43 touchdowns. And I mean, when he's played 16 or more games, in his career, he's hit the 4,500 yard mark every single time. And he's also thrown for a minimum of 34 touchdowns in all of those seasons, right? If you think Joe Burrow is going to be healthy, history tells us that he's going to be a top 10 quarterback. And I'm sure I don't need to tell you he's a top 10 quarterback, but he's finished every season that he's been in 16 or more games. He's been a top 10 quarterback. And in the seasons he hasn't, he's finished outside the top 10 in points per game too. So When I look at Joe Burrow, again, my biggest concern is the rushing, right? He did run for 201 yards last year, which is actually pretty decent, for a pocket passer. I just look at some of the guys that go around Burrow, right? You have Alvin Kamara, who I'm drafting a lot of. You have Roma Dunze. You have Trevion Henderson. You have Chris Olave. You have RJ Harvey. These are guys that I find myself drafting and clicking that button over Joe Burrow. I think it depends on your draft strategy. Some people like to just solidify an elite quarterback, but when a quarterback doesn't have a ton of upside with his legs and it's a pocket passer, there are concerns about, everything has to go right. And, they didn't really bring in an established running back. It looks like it's going to be Chase Brown. And then a guy like that I like in Taj Brooks. That should be helpful for, Burrow to throw more touchdowns. There's also more continuity in the offense. Mike Gesicki is back, right? Their offensive line is pretty much returning almost everybody, I believe. And then obviously the pass catchers, right? And it also looks like Jermaine Burton is maybe taking steps forward to, maturing. And he seems like he's come in with a more clear head. So that's all in favor of Joe Burrow if you want to draft him here. I personally, my draft strategy, I generally don't take swings, as I said, on quarterbacks that don't have a lot of rushing upside this early in drafts because you're sacrificing at other positions, right? If you draft Joe Burrow or any of the other elite, quarterbacks in the first 4 to 5 rounds, which right now Joe Burrow is a 4th round pick, you're likely going to be a little thin somewhere else on top end talent because you're taking a quarterback earlier. And to me, outside of Jaden Daniels, Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, and Jalen Hurts, right? Like, I don't unless something goes disastrously wrong for them, there's not a world, in my opinion, where, those guys are not really good for fantasy and top 10 quarterbacks at worst this season, right? With Joe Burrow, there is a world where he is not, inside the top 8, right? I could see that happening. And so that's why to me, if I'm going to take a chance on an elite quarterback, I'd rather take a bite out of the apple of one of those other guys that I mentioned over Burrow. But other people might position it and say, you know what? You're getting a discount on an elite quarterback by taking Burrow behind those guys and maybe getting top end talent where you would be drafting those guys if you wanted to secure an elite quarterback. So, for me, I don't tend, I have exposure to Burrow in best ball. I don't know that I'll have a ton of exposure to him in redraft because, again, if I'm taking a chance, it's going to be on those guys. And there's a lot of other quarterbacks later on that I find myself really being intrigued about that I'd rather maybe take a chance on. So that's going to wrap it up for Joe Burrow. Let's go ahead and move on to the next player. It's going to be Oronde Gadsden, the second, who is the tight end rookie for the Chargers. This is a guy that went 5th round out of Syracuse, very athletic player, 6'5", 243, 33-inch arm length. And Gadsden's made some waves, right, in camp, in mini camp, right, in OTAs. This is a guy that's been talked about a decent amount, and he's going undrafted, right? When I talk about Gadsden, part of the Risers and Fallers show is to give a good mix of NFL and fantasy and give you some perspective. Am I going to sit here and tell you that for redraft, you should be drafting Gadsden? Absolutely not. Unless, he really, really is taking a stronghold for, the starting role before the season starts. Sure. Then maybe you take a chance on him in redraft. Absolutely. With Justin Herbert. But in this case scenario, in best ball, he's going, 296, right? Like, this is a guy that's going undrafted, right? And so to me, I like to get some exposure to, some high variance tight ends, especially very athletic ones. If just like quarterback, if I'm not taking, an anchor tight end, like if I'm not taking a Kittle, if I'm not taking a Trey McBride or a Brock Bowers, like, I like to to draft 3 tight ends in best ball and, especially guys that have high end upside and good variance. I mean, this is a guy that had 73 catches last season, right? 4.65 40-yard dash, so a sub 4.7 40, and he's got a 34-inch vertical. Like, this is a very athletic player. And Chargers OC Greg Roman came out and said that, he's a young guy, really afforded himself, very mature, and he really thinks that he's going to ascend quickly. He's flashing some really good things. There was also news that, he had a 20-yard catch and connection with Justin Herbert on a wheel route, and he caught several passes from Herbert in minicamp practice on day 2. And these are all encouraging signs for a guy. And he's a guy that, if you play Dynasty and you really like deep players, Gadsden's a guy you probably are familiar with. And, if you haven't had your rookie draft, maybe a guy you should start considering, in those drafts, because again, he's a pretty intriguing player. And when you think about what this Chargers offense has wanted to do, they tried to bring in Evan Ingram, right? And Evan Ingram ends up going to the Broncos, but it was pretty much between Denver and the Chargers, and they swung and missed. And so now it's Will Dissly, it's Tyler Conklin. But when you think about Mark Andrews, who played in Baltimore with Greg Roman, you also think about the tight ends that have been successful with Harbaugh, in his college days and in the NFL. They like to use these athletic tight ends. And, Mark Andrews under Greg Roman, right, had 10 touchdowns his second year of his career, and the first year Roman was with the Ravens. And you just look at how Mark Andrews was used. He went on a tear from 2019 until 2022, right? And then obviously he got hurt in 2023, and then he started off slow in 2024, which is actually kind of crazy because he's still at 11 touchdowns, a career high for Mark Andrews in 2024. So I think they want to address the tight end position. I'm not going to sit here and say, pound the table for, again, a 5th round tight end, but he's somebody to take a look at, somebody to take notice of and think about if you are still drafting your rookie drafts and if you're drafting in best ball. And we'll see if his role develops. The big thing for him is going to be blocking, as it is with many young tight ends. Can he become an effective blocker? Because I think in this scheme, they're going to need that. But the good news is Will Dissly can block, right? Tyler Conklin can block. So those guys maybe can be a lift there, and it can allow Gadsden to maybe work in more of a pass catching role, in a lot of situations. But let's go ahead and move on to our next guy. It's another tight end. It's going to be Colston Loveland. Colston Loveland is a faller right now. And right now he's a faller for me. Excuse me. He's a faller for me, but he's up 2 spots, right? He's going at 122, tight end 10. But recent news for Colston Loveland is there's a very solid chance. It seems like he might not be ready at the start of training camp. Chicago Bears coach Ben Johnson said he's unsure if the rookie tight end Colston Loveland, who's dealing with that shoulder injury, will be full go for the start of training camp at the end of July. This is a guy who had surgery on his shoulder in January. And, right now he's lifting weights, he's running routes, he's catching some passes. But, his final hurdle is being able to get that strength and mobility back. And so right now he's just getting some mental reps. I think Colston Loveland is a guy that I am fading. I am not drafting Colston Loveland in many situations this season. You want to talk to me about Dynasty? I love Colston Loveland. I like the landing spot. I think he's got a really good future there. They took him 10th overall. I think they have a lot of faith, and they have big plans for this guy. But this season, I don't know how much I'm going to be taking chances on him in a crowded offense that, featured 3 wide receivers last year with 100+ targets. Now, it's Ben Johnson. It's a different coach. And people will sit here and remind me of, what happened with Sam Laporta under Ben Johnson as a rookie. The pass catching weapons in Detroit that year. I mean, Laporta was the leading target getter with 100+ targets. The next guy was Khalif Raymond, who had some targets, I think somewhere at like 64, 65. J-Mo didn't have more than Khalif Raymond that year. And so there weren't great pass catchers in that offense, right? You can tell me Jahmyr Gibbs. Okay, that's fine. But there are way more pass catchers in this offense. They bring in, Luther Burden. They have Rome Odunze year 2. They have, DJ Moore, right? Cole Kmet is out there still. I know people don't love Cole Kmet, but he's a guy that's going to be in this offense. They like to use 2 tight end sets. He is getting work with Caleb Williams right now. These guys are on the field learning the playbook. We'll see how long it takes Loveland to get integrated in the offense, but if we're sitting here 2 weeks into training camp and Loveland hasn't put on the pads, this is a slow developing position, man. This is a tight end position that like you need to be able to block. You need to be able to like that strength has to be there. We've seen so many athletic tight ends that unfortunately, don't have that strength and it doesn't and they have a hard time translating. Again, I like Colston Loveland, but it could take him some time, to coming back from that injury with the shoulder to, get up to speed and be effective in this offense while these other guys are getting valuable reps with Caleb Williams and earning Ben Johnson's trust right now. You look at some of the other players going around Loveland, and I would much rather take some chances. We're going to talk about another guy right after this who I much prefer over Loveland, but looking at some of the other tight ends, Mark Andrews goes 108 right now. Evan Ingram, 109. Jonnu Smith's at 110, which is actually pretty funny because Jonnu Smith was like a top 70 pick and he's dropped like 40 spots, which is kind of nuts. But I don't want to get into Jonnu Smith, but obviously the rumors of the trade and everything else. But, I'd much rather take a chance on David Njoku, who goes pick 130, who goes behind Colston Loveland. I would much rather David Njoku, which I think is a huge discount right now. So, with Loveland, it's just about, hoping he can get on the field and, and get acclimated. And maybe this outlook looks a little bit different if he is ready for camp. But I wasn't super high on him this season to begin with. That's been my stance. You can, come back to this later. If Loveland ends up being really good this year, totally fine. But I'd rather take chances on other players. And that's just how I roll, especially at the tight end position. I generally look for veterans, unless it's a high-end rookie. And there's just not enough. I don't think there's enough to go around this season for Loveland to be a difference maker, which there's other guys like Njoku who finds himself in a much favorable room, right? Where I think he's established what his role is in that offense. But let's move on to our next player who, I did tease a little bit because I would much prefer him over Loveland, and that's Tucker Kraft. Tucker Kraft, this is a guy that I am super excited about Tucker Kraft. I like more and more every day. I feel like I grow like more and more excited about Tucker Kraft and what he can do in this offense. When we sit here and I'll get it out the way first. Tucker Kraft is a riser. He's up one spot. And this is a guy that I am absolutely smashing this year. I am going to get a ton of exposure to Tucker Kraft. When you look at Tucker Kraft right now, tight end 13, ADP of 136. He's the cheapest Packers pass catcher when you think of Jaden Reed and, Matthew Golden, right? He's cheaper than both of those guys who are going, at and around top 100 picks, right? And so I think Tucker Kraft, there is a world where he could be the most attractive, and he is, for me, the most attractive pass catcher in this offense, especially at cost. Jordan Love recently came out and said, a big part of going into this offseason is finding ways to continue to get Tucker Kraft the football, get him as many touches as we can in the game. He's a dynamic playmaker, and that's going to be a focus. When you look at this Packers offense and these pass catchers, they've continuously let down Jordan Love. Tons of drops, right? Not developing into the players we thought they would. Jaden Reed at this point is more of a gadgety player, right? Christian Watson is no longer likely going to be there this season with the injury last year, unless he comes back towards the end of the year. And that's a red zone target that they no longer have, right? Tucker Kraft is number 2 in line in the red zone. And I think he's number 1 in terms of passing target. He's the number 1 target in the red zone in this offense that I expect to be good again this year. And then obviously Josh Jacobs, I think, is the number 1 guy in the red zone, but that's not as a pass catcher. It's just overall in the offense because we know what they like to do with the football. And they really, really like Josh Jacobs. But when you take a look at Tucker Kraft's numbers last year, he was 4th in touchdowns for tight ends, 7th in receiving yards. He was 18th in targets and 18th in receptions at the tight end position. He maximized his touches last season in this offense. And he's a great yards after catch guy. And he's somebody that Jordan Love, I think, trusts. And again, I just think that there's not a lot of trust in this offense with these pass catchers in Green Bay. And I really, really like Tucker Kraft. I think he's going to be a guy that is going to come at a very, very strong value. So I'm drafting him as in as many places as I can get him, right? Yards after catch. He's a big time player. He's 24 years old, 6'5, 254, and he was a third round pick, right? Luke Musgrave is kind of a thing of the past at this point. Tucker Kraft is the guy. And I don't see that changing one bit unless there's an injury to him and Musgrave steps up, which is kind of similar to what happened to Musgrave when he lost that job. But overall, I'm excited about Tucker Kraft. I think he's going to have a really, really big role in this offense this season. And he's somebody that I'm drafting a ton of. And I think you should be too, especially if you're not going to spend high end capital at the tight end position. He's one of my favorite targets to take a look at. But that's going to do it for me, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Chuck Bass will be back next week. We're going to continue this show. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you so much for the support, and I'll see you guys next time.